Likita, you can start in 1 or 2 minutes.
Yes, sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening to one and all present here. My name is Gunanika, Secretary of SSN ACMW Student Chapter. On behalf of the team, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Madhavan Mukund, our speaker for the ACM India ESP talk titled Replicated Data Types from Practice to Theory. Faculty members, industry professionals, coordinators of this event, and my fellow students present in this meeting. We are ecstatic to be joining hands with ACM Chennai Regional Chapter, SRM ACM Chapter, and SSN ACM Student Chapter to conduct our first eminent speaker program for this academic year. I would like to call our HOD of the department, Dr. Chitra Babu ma'am, to say a few words.
Thank you, Gunanika. Good evening to one and all. I am extremely delighted in welcoming all of you for this ESP talk by Professor Madhavan Mukund, Director of Chennai Mathematical Institute, which is being jointly organized by our college, ACMW and ACM student chapters, as well as ACM and ACMW Chennai professional chapters. At this juncture, I would like to proudly recall the fact that SSN's ACM student chapter was inaugurated by Professor Madhavan 8.5 years back, and the chapter has evolved quite a lot during this past decade. It has been organizing lots of coding contests and workshops in various emerging technologies. ACMW chapter was started 3.5 years back, and our female students have shown remarkable enthusiasm in organizing a variety of events that have a tremendous impact in enhancing the coding skills of students. I would like to urge all the students who are attending this who are not ACM student chapter members at this point in time to strongly consider becoming student chapter members. As more students become part of the ACM community, more activities can be planned and organized. Please give a serious thought to this. I would like to thank all the office bearers of both the ACMW and ACM student chapters and the faculty coordinators Madheshwari and Sujauddin for leading and supporting the students. And I also would like to thank Mohan Sir, Chair of ACM Chennai Professional Chapter, and Dr. Pushpalata of SRM, Chair of ACMW Chennai Professional Chapter, for joining with us in organizing this talk. At this juncture, I would like to express my desire of student chapters and professional chapters joining hands for promoting the cause of ACM India's one of the key education initiatives, CS Pathshala, and organizing more outreach programs towards bringing computational thinking to schools. Thank you, Madhavan, for agreeing to give this talk amidst your busy schedule. Over to Gunanika for introducing the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. With immense pleasure, I would like to introduce a speaker for today's ESP talk. Dr. Madhavan Mukund, Director at Chennai Mathematical Institute, focuses on research areas including models for concurrent and distributed systems, formal verification, and distributed algorithms. He received his BTech in Computer Science and Engineering from IIT Bombay. He received his PhD in Computer Science at the esteemed Aarhus University. He has served as a president of the ACM India Council between 2016 and 2018. He has served as the national coordinator of the Indian Computing Olympiad since 2002. He has also served as the executive director of the International Olympiad in Informatics from the year 2011 to 2014. In addition to the NPTEL MOOC program, he has contributed lectures on algorithms to the Massively Empowered Classroom project of Microsoft Research and the QEEE program of MHRD. He is a fellow of the Indian Academy of Sciences. We're honored to have this accomplished intellect join us for delivering today's ESP talk. Audience, you can type in your questions for the speaker in the chat box at any time. The questions will be answered during the Q&A session. I'd like to hand over the session to Dr. Madhavan Mukund. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you, Chitra. It's always a pleasure to talk at an event at SSN, even if it is virtual and not in person. I hope that things will normalize and we'll see each other soon more often. So, I'm not completely familiar with Teams, so let me hope I get this right. So, so I hope that something is visible from my screen.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so it is my statutory obligation before I begin my talk to show you a slide about ACM India. So that somebody doesn't complain that I didn't do this. Right. So as Chitra said, ACM is an important society. It is in fact the world's largest society of computing professionals, both academic and industry, and students also. Over 1 lakh members worldwide. 10% of this worldwide membership is in India. So India has a significant role to play in ACM. And ACM India Council charts a kind of course for ACM, which is specific to India. In particular, it focuses a lot on education and other aspects which are more fundamental to India. And CS Pathshala is one of these, as Chitra said. So you have this thing which is an initiative to basically teach computational thinking in schools. So I'm trying to get to this 1 second. My device has gone a bit bonkers. Okay, so let me just manage somehow. So CS Pathshala is a initiative to do computational thinking in schools, and it's basically something which is of interest right now because in parallel with this, there is a conference on computational thinking in schools being organized by CS Pathshala and ACM India, which is going on starting today. But also for students, ACM has been organizing summer schools for the last 3 years. They also have a doctoral dissertation award for the best PhD thesis. And recently more awards have been instituted for contributions to education for young researchers and so on. So ACM is moving ever forward, and I hope that many of you will join ACM and not just be passive members, but will also contribute to the activities in the years to come. So with this, let me get back to what I'm supposed to talk about, if I can find it. Just hang on. Right. So the title of today's talk is Replicated Data from Practice to Theory. Okay? And there is the title is intentional because we often talk about theory to practice, but this is an area in which practice is far ahead of the theory and we are catching up. And as a theoretician, one of the goals that I have is to try to explain and clarify what the practitioners are doing. Okay, so this is joint work with several people. You can see Ahmed Wajani and Constantine Nenaya are in Paris. Gautam Shenoy was a PhD student at CMI. Suresh is my colleague. And this is a kind of auspicious day, 29th of September 2021, because today the PhD thesis of Gautam Shenoy, which is based on this, has been sent to the examiners. So it's been a long time coming, but finally it's done. So we are working in the context of distributed systems. So for us, a distributed system is a abstract concept. It just consists of some n nodes connected by a network. So the network is asynchronous. So the nodes communicate with each other, but there's no fixed guarantee on delays of how long a message takes to reach. And we do assume, though, that communication is reliable. So there are many things that can go wrong in a network, as we all know, right? Messages can get lost, links can fail, nodes can fail, and so on. So we are going to assume at least that if the network is up, then messages will reach. Okay, and messages are in some sense reliably transmitted, but nodes can fail and recover because this is something which is not in our control, and nodes failing is kind of equivalent to links failing. So if a node becomes disconnected from the network because the connectivity goes, it's as good as the node failing from an external perspective. So nodes may fail and recover infinitely often, but nodes do not fail in a very catastrophic way. So when a node recovers, we assume that there is some state which is a valid state of its history from which it will recover. So you have to make some assumptions, otherwise everything is impossible. So these are some assumptions that we will make, right? So this is more background. We're not going to really, we're not really going to worry too much about how this failure happens and all that. That's not going to be the part of the thing. So, but this is just to give you some background. So what is our focus? Our focus is what is called a replicated data type. So as we all are now familiar with, when we store something on the cloud, it's not stored in a single place, right? The data has to be replicated for various reasons. One is, of course, for just redundancy, but also for latency, because if the data is not stored at multiple places, then there can be a lot of delays in accessing the data and people will not get the quality of service that they want. So we have a data type or a data structure. Now, a data structure, I mean some abstract thing. It could be a file, it could be a SQL database, it could be something concrete, but it is basically replicated. So the same data is stored in multiple nodes on our distributed system. But because the reason for this is, as I said, mainly because of geographical proximity. So typically when you interact with this data structure, you will talk to one of these replicas, right? So queries and updates can be addressed to any replica. So each client, so to speak, each user of the system will interact with the replica which is available to that person based on how they connect. So queries and updates are the two types of interactions that we have. As you would expect, a query is something which asks something about the data structure, so it doesn't change anything. So it's side effect free. When you make a query, nothing changes inside. And on the other hand, an update is when you actually make a change to the state of the data structure. You might insert some value or change a value or delete a value or something. So there are many typical applications. So when you buy something on an online shopping site like Amazon, you don't necessarily have to pay for it as soon as you select it. So you can accumulate over time and think about whether you're looking for a better option or not. So a shopping cart is a data structure, right? It stores the kind of the items that you have selected before you buy them. And this is now stored in multiple Amazon servers. And it can be the case that you can remove things and add things to the shopping cart without actually making a purchase. And now you have to make sure that the shopping cart reflects your sequence of choices that you have made. Google Docs, which we are quite used to now, is also a thing. So it's quite common for, especially nowadays in this online mode, that two people might be interacting on a call like this and simultaneously editing a document which they are trying to generate. So both people are accessing the same document. This document may not even be on the same server for both the people, and yet you have to share it and update it. Then you have minor things like, like counters in Facebook and so on. An early example of something like this was, which is still available, is the domain name service. If you take a name like whatever, google.com, and it gets translated to an IP address, that lookup is done in a distributed way. So that's not stored in any one place. It's stored in a number of places, and there is a strategy for locally accumulating this information and serving it to you. So these are just typical examples of replicated data types. And a typical data structure that you would like to store in such a distributed storage is, say, a set of values. So the shopping cart can be thought of as a set of values. You are not particular about what order you put things into that shopping cart. You just want to know what is there and what is not there. So a query might be membership, right? Is a particular item a member of the set or not? And the updates will be to add and remove items, right? So you might update something by adding something to the set and removing something from the set. So now if the set is stored in a number of places, right? What will happen is that you will have different clients or different users of the system interacting with different replicas and doing different things. So in particular, if you have let's say hypothetically a single shopping cart which is being shared by a family, then maybe there are 3 or 4 different people, that family, who are simultaneously adding and subtracting from it. Okay, so imagine that scenario. So here you have client A, B, C, D, and A is interacting with replica 2, B and C are interacting with replica 3, and D is interacting with the last replica. And some of them are adding items, some of them are removing items, and some of the items are being added and removed by different people. So if you look at client B is adding X and client D is removing X, and at the same time client A is asking whether X belongs to S. So these are all updates and queries which interact, and you have to resolve. So when I add something, remove something, and ask whether it's there, you have to figure out what should be the correct answer. It's not even clear what should be the correct answer. So what we refer to as the source replica is the replica which receives the concrete request from a client. So that is the replica with which the client directly interacts. But remember, these are replicas. So once you make an interaction with one client, that information has to be fed to everybody. Right? So for instance, if I ask a query of replica 2, then I will get an answer from replica 2 based on what it knows. But if I make an update to replica 3, then it's not enough for just replica 3 to make this update. It has to remember, a query did not change anything. So it's okay for just returning the answer. But when I make a change to something in the set, then this change has to be propagated. So typically what happens is that the source replica will first make the change, of course, and then it will have to inform all the other replicas. So there will be some transactions which happen behind the scenes, which you are not aware of as a user of the system, which propagate these updates to other replicas. And this propagation has to be done carefully. So there has to be some information identifying this update. So some kind of metadata, there can be some timestamp and so on, to resolve contradictory updates. As I said, if one person says add X, other person says remove X, then the replicas need to have some idea about what is the priority that. So that is really the kind of issue that we want to address when theoretically analyzing these replicated data types. So the crucial property that you want for any database or any data store is consistency, right? So you want to make sure that the data is correct, that there are no inconsistent updates. And this becomes a particular problem with this distributed setting, because you have to reason about the state of the data structure as a whole. But notice that we said that each replica, the source replica for a query, doesn't consult the others. So you just make a response based on what you have seen so far, which may or may not reflect all the updates made. So in this type of a limited knowledge scenario, partial knowledge scenario, where you may not be aware of all the updates, what does consistency mean? Right? So consistency in a sort of sequential setting is something which we understand, and it has different connotations. So when you're doing database transactions, for instance, where you have multiple updates which constitute an atomic change, consistency means that you will either see all of it or you don't see any of it. You don't see any intermediate states. But in this case, the problem is that there are intermediate situations where one replica has made an update, but the other replica has not heard from it, but gets a query about the state and has to answer without having heard. So before we get into this question of what this consistency means, we have to ask, what can we hope to achieve? So consistency in an informal setting says that all the nodes see the same data at the same time. That is, if it doesn't matter which replica I ask, I must get the same answer. Okay? So this would mean that before I answer any query, I must make sure that all the recent updates have reached me. Availability is related to response, right? So you would like that systems don't get into a kind of black hole. You don't ask a question and you get no answer because it's waiting for example, some updates to come from somewhere else. So every request must receive a status response. Now, the status response can be that I can't answer your question, but it can't just hang. And the third thing, which is very critical in the network setting, especially in the internet setting, is that if some nodes get disconnected for whatever reason, so they either fail themselves or the links fail, right? The updates should not get affected. So you should have partition tolerance. So you should be resilient to failures in connectivity. And so C stands for consistency, A for availability, and P for partition tolerance. And there is this bottleneck called the CAP theorem, which was first claimed by Eric Brewer and in a limited way proved by Nancy Lynch and Gilbert in 2002, which basically says you can't get all three of these in any network. And the so-called proof of this is actually quite, some sense, simplistic. So it's not very difficult. I'm not going to talk about it, but if you go and read this Gilbert and Lynch paper, it's rather obvious why you cannot do this. But now for us, now this becomes a problem, right? So we want to get some combination of these. Now, which combination should we get? So if we are looking at distributed data, cloud services, we have to accept the fact that some servers will get unreachable for various reasons. We cannot prevent it because these can happen due to circumstances beyond our control, like power failures or storms or anything like that. Right? So network failures are unavoidable. So we must have the P. We must have partition tolerance. Now, what the CAP theorem tells us is that if you have only 2 out of 3 and you must have P, then you must give up C or you must give up A. So if you look at traditional databases will focus on C. So if you look at traditional distributed databases, they are very hung up on getting consistency. You should never get an answer which is not up to date. But most of the applications that we deal with in the context of these replicated data types are really internet-based things where the quality of service is more important than the quality of the answer, unfortunately, right? So we are all used to the fact that we try to buy something or we book something and then it says this is no longer available, right? So after you have gone through a sequence of examining options and then you select it and then you finally try to add it and it will say, sorry, this is not available or the price has changed. You try to book a ticket, that ticket is gone. So somehow, this fact that the data is mildly inconsistent is something we are willing to accept. But if we have to sit there for 3 minutes for an answer, we will not accept it. So web services require high availability. And then the CAP theorem tells us if you want high availability and you want partition tolerance, you have to focus on giving up something about C. You cannot expect this foolproof consistency. So you have to go for a weakening of consistency. And that is the question. What is this? What is a weaker notion of consistency that is acceptable for us? So in the most general setting, this is something which is called eventual consistency, or kind of what I've written here is strong eventual consistency. So the way you should think about strong eventual consistency is that while updates are happening, there will of course be inconsistencies among the replicas because different replicas have seen different subsets of the updates. But suppose magically your system goes into some kind of a quiet state, a maintenance state, okay? Then all the updates which have happened so far should eventually reach all the replicas and every one of them must be in an identical state. Now, this is not completely, it sounds reasonable that it should happen, but there are problems with this simply because the updates, as we will see, can be incompatible, like adding and removing. So even though every update may reach every replica, all messages are reliably delivered. If one replica sees the adding an element to the shopping cart before it sees the remove, then the shopping cart will first add it and then remove it, and the element will no longer be there. Whereas if these messages reach another replica in the opposite order, then it will first try to remove an element which is not there, and it will say, okay, there's not there, so I just vacuously removed, or maybe it was already there, who knows? But this is a set. But then it got added back, so then it will be there. So the ordering matters, and strong eventual consistency is more, it promises more than it appears to, which is that all this reordering will not affect. Right? So this is really what we are saying, that after a period of quiescence, all the replicas converge. Now, in reality, this is not going to happen. Nobody is going to shut down Google Docs for some time so that all the replicas converge, right? So the practical way of thinking about it is that after a sufficient amount of time passes, updates which have happened a long time back have all been propagated, right? So basically, if I check 5 minutes from now, then all the updates which were made up to 5 minutes ago would have reached everybody. The last 5 minutes might be in a transience. So it's a kind of rolling quiescence in some sense. It's like a moving consistency. But so the last few updates may not be up to date, but the more recent thing, less recent thing, that is more in the past, will be done. So this is what strong eventual consistency guarantees. So here is a very old example from the early days of Facebook. So here is I mean, I'm not on Facebook, so don't ask me whether this is real or not, but there's somebody who claims it is. So on the left-hand side is a kind of conversation, and on the right-hand side, there are some updates. And this is being run. I mean, this is the kind of the owner of this account has made an update, okay, which appears there but does not appear in their own conversation. So it's kind of, this is the kind of inconsistency that we see, right? And it's more and more common now that we have more and more applications which use this. So here is, so this is my own thing, right? So this is from Demon, right? 2017 or whenever it was. So I was new to Paytm, but I had to set it up. Somehow I needed to pay Uber without cash because I didn't have any cash. So I was trying to figure out a way to set up Uber to accept electronic payment from me so that I could pay Uber at the end of the ride. And for various reasons, neither was working. So there is a screenshot here which shows on my phone. This is my phone. Okay, this is a real screenshot. You can see on the top right, it's at the same time, 1507. Right? The left-hand side is the Uber app. The right-hand side is the Uber website. And one of them claims that Paytm is attached to my Uber account. The right-hand side shows that some credit card is attached to my account. So both of them have inconsistent information. Right? They are both run by the same. They're both whatever reading presumably data from the same organization. Right? And I am reading it from the same place. So I should also be logically connected to the same server. But apparently the app connects to a different server from the website. So this is the kind of problem that as users we see with distributed this lack of consistency. So the same thing will happen. I mean, it happens to me quite often that if I delete something from Gmail on my desktop and then I look at Gmail on my phone, that message stays for a while before it goes. Right? It takes a little while for that message update to get reflected on other devices. So it just shows that even if you're in the same geolocation, you're not necessarily connected to the same server. So this is the question that we want to deal with. I mean, so eventually, yes, these two both get reconciled. But at this transient stage, how do we make sure that they come up with the same answer at the end? So notice that eventual consistency, I should specify clearly, does not say that there is a correct answer. Right? It just says they must give the same answer. So you can decide what that answer should be. So it's not that there is a correct value that they should converge to, but they should all converge to the same value. Now that same value might be, you might argue that it is the wrong value, but they should not say inconsistent things. That's all we're saying. Okay. So for example, if I add and remove, right, you have to decide whether the add has priority or the remove has priority. Now you can argue both ways, but you have to decide on one of them. If I have add and remove, which happen in two parallel replicas with no constraint on the order, finally, should the element be in my set or should it not be in my set? So once you have decided that, then everybody in that, all the nodes in that system should agree on that. So that's what eventual consistency means. So this is very hard, of course, it's hard enough programming in the real world. It's even harder programming concurrent things. And it's worse than hard to program something which is eventually consistent. So one strategy to get around this was proposed by Shapiro's group in Paris. So they said, let us provide as a programming kind of interface a data type which is automatically consistent in this way. So if you use this, so it's like saying that, if I use say a dictionary in Python, then I'm guaranteed that without my doing anything, that it will be kind of a random access lookup by key. Right? I don't have to program it. It's given to me. So it's given to me as a usable data set. So similarly, I will give you a so-called conflict-free data type in which you can write your distributed application, and users, when they make updates, it will automatically reconcile itself. So you don't have to program that reconciliation. It's built into the language support. So they proposed such conflict-free data type implementations for different types of data structures like counters and sets and graphs, okay, which become strongly eventually consistent by the way they are designed and implemented. And as we said before, behind the scenes, these nodes have to exchange information. So these data structures have to maintain some auxiliary data to reconcile the updates. And there are two ways that you can do this. So one is, as we saw in that example, that every time you get an update at one replica, you send it to everybody else. So there's an operation-based approach where each operation that is received, which updates the state, is then propagated to every other replica. The other way is that you periodically broadcast your state to everybody. So this is called state-based. So state-based basically says that each replica will periodically say, this is what I believe about this data structure right now, and somebody else will have contradictory information and they will merge these two. So state-based obviously transfers more information at a time, but it transfers it in a more disciplined way. Operation-based transfers less information at a time, but it transfers it in a kind of asynchronous way. So different operations will come at different times. So they both have their pluses and minuses in terms of which is easier to work with in terms of concrete data structures. So to give a specific example of this, let's think of how you would maintain a distributed counter. Right? So this is like a Facebook like counter. For instance. You want to keep track of the number of likes, but people are hitting like at different places. So this counter is being incremented at multiple locations. So if there are n replicas, each of them maintains a vector or an array of n counters. Right? So each of them keeps track of what it believes are the number of increments that every other counter in the system has. So you need to know n in advance, obviously, for this, right? So you know n in advance. So supposing n is 17, then there are 17 different servers which are maintaining this, and each client connects to one of these servers. So if I look at server 3, for instance, server 3 has its own array of 17 counters saying how many increments has replica 1 got, how many increments the replica 2 got, as far as it knows. So when it gets a replica itself, so this replica number 3, when it gets an increment from a client, of course, it can update its increment correctly because it knows all the replica updates that it has got itself. But how do you make sure that you get information from others? So let's do the state-based merging. So periodically, I get an array from, say, counter 7. So number 7 sends me their array. I have an array 3. Now, I know that my information about 3 is better than that guy's information about 3 because I am 3 and that guy is not 3. Right? So I can throw away whatever he says about 3. But I know that he knows more about 7 than I know about 7. So I will take whatever he tells me about 7. What about the other guys? Well, remember that this is a very specific counting operation, right? I'm going +1, +1. So if I believe that number 9 has got 12 updates and the person who sends me the state from 7 believes that number 9 has got only 11 updates, then the answer must be 12, right? Because if I believe it has 12 updates, that somebody has told me at some point that there have been 12 updates. So there cannot be only 11 updates because I cannot undo an update in this model. So if I have a counter which only increments, then I can just take the max, right? So basically when I get my array and I get somebody else's array, I just take the max. And this gives me a consistent update. And then when I want to answer a query, how many updates, what is the value of the counter now? I'm not aggregating these counts, right? So I have the count increments which came to 1, increments came to 2, increments came to 3 separately, right? So when I get a query saying what is the current value of the counter, I will add up all these things. I'll say so far 1 has got so many increments, 2 has got so many increments. So the sum of all this is the value, right? So this becomes a typical distributed counter implementation. So therefore, you have much more data than one counter, right? Everybody is, so there are n copies of these arrays of size n. So you have like n squared space being stored instead of one integer, right? Or even if you had n of them, there would be only n integers. So they don't keep one counter each, they keep a vector of counters or an array of counters. So that's why you get this blow up in terms of implementation metadata. Here the metadata is very simple, it's just a vector. But if I come to something like a set, I have to be a little more careful because it's not as straightforward as an increment in a counter, which can only go in one direction, right? So once I can increment, so even in a counter, you can imagine that if I have increments and decrements, right, then you would not be able to use that current strategy, but you will have to do something more sophisticated. So let's look at a set, right? So I have add x, remove x, and membership. Is x a member of the set? But add and remove conflict. So the question, this goes back to the same thing we had before. What is the net effect of conflicting operations, right? So we have to define a conflict resolution property. So if I add something and I remove something, so that that should be remove x, I'm sorry. So if I add x and I remove x, right, then is x in S, if it happens concurrently, right, should be defined. You can argue either way, as I said, right? So it's not a question of correctness, but of consistency. You just have to say that whenever I see both an add and a remove the same element happening in parallel, then one of them has precedence. One of them will be the final outcome. Either the element will stay or it will be removed. So the add wins. Okay? The add wins is the more popular thing, and it's this type of a set where add beats remove is called an OR set. OR for observed remove. So this is some obscure terminology, but this is what the literature uses. So an OR set is just a set in which add has more priority than remove. Right? If I do an add and a remove at the same time in different copies of my data structure, then they eventually, when they all the replicas get both the add and the remove, they will keep the add and throw away the remove. So basically the element will be in my set. So this is where we got into this story. So Shapiro, as I said, in 2011 had defined these kinds of data structures for these conflict-free replicated data types. So if you looked at their paper, it would say something like this. It would essentially give you a correctness argument for the data type in terms of the operations that are being performed. It's like saying that bubble sort is correct because whenever I see two elements next to each other, I swap them and then I do it from 1 equal to n and then 2 equal to n and so on, and therefore it is correct. Right? It doesn't give you any confidence just by saying that I'm doing these things and therefore it must be correct. So in the same way, if you looked at the literature on CRDTs, it will say that I use these timestamps and these timestamps work in this way and so on. And therefore, if these timestamps have this property, then I will consider it added. Otherwise, I'll consider it removed. And therefore, it is correct. So it was very much tied to the way the implementation was given. So it's like, you justify the code by referring to the code, which doesn't seem to make sense. So our goal was to reformulate this thing in such a way that you have separately what needs to be done, right? Bubble sort is correct if the final answer is in ascending order. That is what I want. So can you guarantee me that this outcome of your operation is going to produce something in ascending order? So that means that what you are doing, and if it's not bubble sort, but insertion sort or selection sort, is every different implementation of sorting finally achieves the same goal. So you want to have this kind of a declarative specification, a functional specification says what should be the outcome, and then you say this is how I'm implementing it. Does it match what should be? So for doing this, you need to have a way of representing this distributed computation in a more abstract way. Right? So one standard way of representing these operations which can be independent and have no specific order is to use, instead of a sequence of operations, to have a partial order of operations. And then what we want to say is that given that these updates and queries and all happen with this partial order, that is, some of them are not ordered with respect to each other, what should be the outcome of a given combination of these queries and updates, right? So this should be such that when I actually see, so what will an actual replica see? Of course, it will not see a partial order, right? When I'm sitting at a replica, one of these nodes, I will get a sequence of, direct client operations plus information from other nodes about what has happened there. So I will see a sequence. That sequence will be compatible with this partial order. And the critical thing about this declarative specification is that the outcome should not depend on what sequentialization a replica sees. If the partial order is the same, every replica should converge to the same answer. Then if you have such a specification, then you can check whether your implementation matches this, whether it actually guarantees that no matter how the actual updates are delivered to the replicas by this indirect messaging, they will still produce a compatible answer. The problem with this approach is that it becomes very messy if you allow all possible features to be part of your partial order. So there are several things which are there in this. So one is in what order are messages delivered, right? So even if we guarantee that messages are delivered and never lost, they could still be delivered out of order. They can be delivered out of order within a channel, that is between two replicas. I send an update to my neighbor. I send another update to my neighbor after that, but the neighbor gets a second update before the first update. So is this allowed? Then you have this more complicated situation, which is on the right-hand side. So I'm sorry, but my pencil is not working, so I can't write on this. So you'll have to bear with me. But if you look at the right-hand side picture on this, right? So I have imagine I have three nodes called I, J, and K, and time is going downwards from top to bottom. So these arrows represent messages. So I sends a green message to J, following which J sends a green message to K. Locally, between any two of these, messages do not get overtaken. That is, an earlier message will not be delivered after a later message. But here, if I look at a direct read message from I to K, it's on a different track. It's on a different channel from I to J and J to K. So I could have started off with a very old message from I heading towards K, which is overtaken indirectly by a message which passed from I to J and J to K. So in a sense, what K has got from the first green message about I indirectly will be more fresh than what it gets directly from I later on. So this kind of a problem is called non-causal delivery. So there is a notion of causality. So if something happens later at K, it should reflect more information, not less information. So one of the things that we need to do at the very least to make sense out of this is to assume that message delivery is causal, right? So it's not just first in, first out. It's not just queue based in an individual channel, but globally there is no violation of this kind of thing where stale messages overtake or get overtaken by fresh messages across channels. Then there are other things like visibility. Which updates do I get to see? Are they only tied to the messages? What do I get indirectly through messages and all that? So all these things become very complicated. So we have a simple model that we will work with. So now that's what our goal is. So first we have to also, I mean, in the style of all formalization, you have to kind of make an abstract definition of what is a conflict-free replicated data type. So essentially you have a set V of values which your data type can store. Right? So this is a universe of what are all the valid things that can be in your data type. So if it is a Google Doc, for instance, it could be a sequence of characters, a string, possibly with some formatting information embedded in that. Right? If it's just a set, then it's just a set of values from this universe and so on. And then you have a set of query operations, set of update operations. So for OR sets, you have an underlying universe of items that can belong to the set. And then you have member of as a query operation and add and remove as the update operation. So when I execute a CRDT, remember what happens is that at the front end, at the client end, each client interacts directly with one of the nodes, one of the replicas called the source replica. And let's assume we are doing this operation based update. So after client B talks to replica 3 in this particular case, that information about adding X to S is sent by 3 to 1 to all up to N, but with some extra information, right? So these are the timestamps or whatever to reconcile. So add XS is the basic operation, but there is this extra information capital Y, which is tagged on so that the other replicas, when they get similar add X or remove X from other things, will be able to decide how to process these. So if I look at the run of the CRDT as a whole globally, right, I will get some sequence of operations corresponding to these different things. So for example, here there's a green initialization, then replica 1 gets an update, replica 2 gets a query, and then after this, the update from replica 1 reaches replica 3, then it reaches replica 2, and so on. So the blue things in this picture correspond to this update 1 plus the 3 messages sent by 1, 2. So there are 4 replicas in this example. So 1 sends this message to 2, 3, and 4. Similarly, the orange update midway happens update 2 at replica 2, and this also gets propagated later to 1, 3, and 4 in some order. So there are 3 updates, U1, U2, U3, and each of them generates 3 messages which are received by the other replicas about this update. And these are interspersed with these queries about the state of the system. So our main interest is to know what is the state of the system. So we can first of all throw away the queries, right? And we can now think of separating this color wise, right? Each of these updates as a unique operation. So each update is a unique operation and each receive is a unique operation. So receiving the update U1 at replica 3 is a separate thing from receiving that update at replica 2, and it's a separate thing from receiving it at replica 4. So this sequence, right, we actually want to separate it out. So one way is to just project it, right? So we look at this. So we look at the bottom row, R1, R3, R2, R4, R2, R3, R1, and so on. So we look at all the R1 things, right? So there is a U1 which happens at R1. Then about a little way down, there is a U3 receive which happens at R1. So R1 has 3 events here. It sends a message right at the it sends a message right at the beginning. Then it receives something from 3, and later right at the end, it receives something from 2. So if I now do this, then this is kind of the per client or per agent order of what that agent sees, and that must appear in the same order as the total global run that we saw, right? So each agent intrinsically is sequential. It sees things in a particular order. And now we have some more things, right? So all the update messages which are received are generated by the corresponding update. So in addition to this local total order, we also have these kind of red arrows, which says that the U1 on replica 1 must be before the receives of the U1 on the other replicas, because they heard about it only because of this, right? So you get this delivery order, which says that the updates are received by a client must match up to the fact that they were sent by the source replica. So these two together, this local order on each client plus this update order, gives us this notion of causality of what happened before, right? So what happens before something else. So this is called, so this was actually a term coined by Leslie Lamport many years ago. So this is called happened before order. Right? So in a distributed system, what can you guarantee happened before something else? So what is unambiguously before? In general, it turns out that this need not be transitive. It's very strange that it could be that A happened before B and B happened before C, but you cannot argue that A happened before C, right? And this is not something which is natural. And this is a problem which is related to what we said earlier about those messages, right? This causally delivered messages. So if you actually assume causal delivery of messages, that is, no messages get overtaken by an indirect route. Right? So you send a direct message, it does not arrive later than some indirect message through some other person. If you have that guarantee of causal delivery, then actually this happened before becomes transitive, and then you can actually think about this whole thing in a sensible way. So once we have that assumption that these things are partial orders where this string is transitive, then you can easily reason about what a replica can see. So a replica can see everything that has happened before its last thing. So if I look at replica 1, then every action which I can trace back from the maximal thing there, which happened before that, is in principle known to replica 1. So this I can think of as a local view of replica 1. Similarly, I can think of this as a local view of replica 2 and so on. So for each replica, I can reason about which of these events in this partially ordered history are actually visible to it. And now the property that we would really want is that this partial order actually is not affected by reordering things in that sequence. So we extracted this order from a sequence. If you remember, we first projected it on each of the replicas and then we drew these red arrows. But it turns out that in that sequence, if we had shuffled things which are not dependent on each other, like supposing we said that R1 receives from U3 before R2, and now we change it to say no, R2 receives it before R1. These don't materially affect what happened overall, and you'll get the same partial order. So happened before is something which actually is uniform across all these linearizations, and that's what we really want. So this is what we really want, that updates which are received in different orders will produce the same happened before on the updates. Right? And now our declarative specification can talk about this order. You can say that, remember this add wins, right? Add wins says that if there are concurrent updates which are of the form add and remove, then add will win. In particular, it means that if there is a single add and there are several removes, all of which are in parallel, the add will beat all of them. So in our declarative specification of this happened before, it says that if I have a maximal add and a maximal remove, then the maximal add will be the answer. So this is the way in which you can use this partially ordered view of the computation to declare what should be the outcome. And then you can ask whether your implementation satisfies it or not. So I'm maybe going to speed up a little and skip some details, but one of the things is that if we are interested in knowing about the past, then in many situations you don't need to actually keep the entire past. Only the recent past is enough, because the earlier past has sort of been subsumed, right? So in particular, for knowing about in an OR set whether a set belongs or not, element belongs or not, if I can examine all the maximal events related to that element, then if any of them is an add, it is there. None of them is an add, then it's not there. If all the maximal updates are removed, then it's not there. Right? So you can actually restrict this history and make it manageable in terms of an implementation. So remember, we talked about metadata and things. So you have to keep this kind of information in your implementation. Somewhere you have to remember this partial order of ancient events. But what we can see is that in many situations, these ancient events, you don't have to keep too many of them. So our goal is really to answer this question, right? So we are given a CRDT which has a declarative specification, right? We have the declarative specification, the abstract thing, and somebody has given us an implementation, right? So can I guarantee that the implementation is correct? So for this, one strategy is that from the specification, you build a kind of reference implementation. So you build a not necessarily efficient implementation, but something which works. And then you can compare these two implementations with each other. Okay, so you can try to do some automata theory and so on, which exists for verification, and do it. So I will leave it at this, but this is the technical part of the stuff, that you can basically take this abstract way of defining the operations, and from that you can define a kind of inefficient but correct machine implementation of what the update should be. And then you can check whether somebody's clever implementation and algorithm matches this. So it becomes now an operational equivalence, which will determine whether or not these things. And operational, if you're familiar with automata theory, operational equivalence is sort of like taking a cross product, right? You take these two things and you make them do the same operations together, and you see if they end up in the same state or not always. If they don't end up in the same state in all cases, then there is a problem, right? If you apply the same sequence, so they in some sense they must execute the same language, and so that becomes our formal thing. So now I'm going to do some fast forward and skip a lot of stuff, right? So this thing works if you have a finite state implementation. If you can build if your data structure is such that you only have finitely many values, then there are only finitely many different states that it can take. For example, if I take a finite set of elements and I build subsets of that, so that is my OR set, right? OR set is a set of values. If the set of values is itself finite, then there are only finitely many sets I can build. Then I can exhaustively, say if I have a set which contains 1, 3, 5, 7, and I add 2, it becomes 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, and so on. So I can exhaustively map all the possible states of my data structure and build one gigantic automaton and work with it. But in many situations, you cannot do that. I mean, you cannot actually, because most realistic implementation like counters and all that will have unbounded integers. So what you can do is you can have a kind of abstraction. You can say something like, this counter is 0 or it is not 0. That is a very crude abstraction. Now, the problem with 0 and not 0 is fine if you're doing only addition, right? If the counter is 0 and I add 1 to it, it is not 0. If it is not 0 and I add 1 to it, it remains not 0. But if I have subtraction, then I have a problem, because if it is not 0, when does it become 0? Because I've forgotten how many times I did an addition. So you can do this kind of abstraction. You throw away some information and build a kind of crude finite state model. And what happens now is that if you have this crude finite state model, it allows things which you would not normally have allowed. For example, if I'm not allowed to take my counter below 0, and if I'm doing subtraction, but I've forgotten how many times I've subtracted, then the finite state model might allow me to go and do a lot more subtractions than allowed. But the good case is that if even with this relaxation, you cannot find an error, you're okay. If you do find an error, you have to check that the error is really there, right? And then if you can genuinely extract that error through a run, you have found a bug. If that error is spurious, then you have to make your model more precise. So this is a standard strategy in verification called counter example guided abstraction refinement. So it's called CIGAR. So abstraction means you throw away some information about your data structure, then you execute it. Now this execution reports some some counterexample. Is this counterexample real or not? The counterexample is real. That is, if you can go back and actually reproduce this counterexample in your data structure, you have found a bug. If you cannot reproduce this counterexample, then your abstraction was not good enough. So you make it a little more elaborate. So that is the refinement. Right? So that's what you can do to implement this. So this is kind of abstract, but there are other aspects. So I'll just quickly cover that and then wind up. So we have talked about this strong eventual consistency. So strong consistency is where everybody is always saying the same thing. And that's what we said we cannot achieve because of the CAP theorem. Eventual consistency, on the other hand, is a little vague. It doesn't tell you anything. It just says that, after a suitable amount of time, everybody will agree. But how long is that time? So sometimes you want stronger guarantees, right? So here is a scenario in which you have two scorers in a football match, right? So one scorer is only reporting to you the goal scored by team A. The other is scoring the goal scored by team B. And you are getting messages from them, but these messages can reach you out of order. So at any given time, right, if at the end of the match the score is 3 to A and 4 to B, you should get the score 3-4. But if all the messages have not reached you, then you could have any prefix. So you could have seen 2 goals for A and none for B, or you could have seen 2 goals for A and 3 for B, or you could have seen 3 goals for A and 2 goals for B. So eventual consistency will say that any of these could be currently your state of knowledge about the system. But you cannot see arbitrary things. For example, if you have seen the score 1-2, I mean, sorry, if you have seen the score 3-2, then you cannot later see the score 1-2. Right? If you already know that A has scored 3 goals, you cannot accept a situation later on where somebody tells you the score is 1-2. So there are various flavors of these eventual consistency. So one of the things that you would like, for example, in a Google Doc, is that if you are writing something into the document, that you should get back what you have written. So if you have made an update, you should see that update. Okay, so somewhere recently I had this problem, and I'm trying to remember where it was not reading what I was writing. So I actually would write something, and then when I looked at it, it would not show me what I had written. It was not Google Doc, but one of these applications, which is really annoying. You know, you make an update, and then you don't see the update that you have just made. Then you don't know whether you have to make it again or not, right? So this is the typical thing that happens when a form crashes, right? You're trying to fill out a form, and then the form crashes. Now you go back there, and then the value that you have just filled in is blank. Now, should you type it again, or is it going to show up? Right? So read your own rights, for example, is a requirement that you might impose, which is beyond strong eventual consistency. So we could have different requirements based on the need. For example, Amazon would like to allow you flexibility to have eventual consistency about the state of your shopping cart. But when you want to pay, it must make sure that the shopping cart is reconciled across all the copies. Right? So a wallet, for instance, right? So if you want to pay somebody from a wallet, and if you have put money into the wallet, then when you go to pay, it should not say that, sorry, this money has not been received, because you just said, and it said transaction was confirmed. So read my own rights, right? So you might have multiple requirements, and this goes beyond just this eventual consistency that we were talking about. So you need to have kind of more elaborate models which talk about these different things. So I won't go into the details, right? So the other thing is that we have subtly assumed that all replicas are the same. That is, any replica will receive an update. But what if you keep one replica, you know, for safeguarding your data, you keep it in some underground bunker in some desert, right? So that it's not affected by anything, any natural calamities and so on. So that replica is always only receiving updates from other replicas. Nobody ever talks to that replica. Right? So then you don't have this guarantee that all replicas will talk to each other all the time, because this replica never talks to anybody, it only receives. So then you have to change various things about your analysis. So there are lots of aspects of this thing which are still murky. I mean, it's not at all clear how to address all these different concerns, right? So in practice, you have publicly available libraries now which offer these kind of conflict-free data types, but they seem to work only when you have non-critical things, like, you know, if you want to keep the highest score in an online game or something, right? So it's more like this counter, right? This counter which keeps going up because you can't reduce the highest score. But when you want some kind of stronger guarantees, then it becomes very hard to program this. So even the existing platforms are not completely transparent as to how to do these things. So there's still a problem, even with the existence of these data types, conflict-free data types. It's not easy to program this. The other thing, of course, is this dealing with this kind of speculation, right? So the price has changed. So all these web services are quite prone to do this. They make you promises, and then they go back and retract that promise. Now, retracting a promise is really a very kind of uncomfortable way of not reading your own rights, right? So what would be a good formal model? So to go back to the title of the talk, right? So we have distributed data stores which are used all over the place. We can build formal models for some of these things, CRDTs, eventual consistency, but people are using these things. So a lot of the advances in this kind of distributed replicated storage has been made by technology-based companies, right? So Google, Amazon, whatever, Dropbox. So these people need to use these services as part of their offering. So they make decisions on how to implement things and what kind of guarantees they will give you based on their perception of what their clients want. Now, this means that various things may be done on an ad hoc basis, or they may be done based on some principle, and you have to figure out which is which. So at some point, somebody has to come and clean up the mess, and that's what theory in this case is good for. So in some cases, theory can predict and give you ideas about how to build something well. In this case, theory serves as a brake, like a handbrake, which goes back and says, okay, this is what you did, but actually it has some pitfalls, and maybe you should have done it some other way. So, or it tells you maybe you should re-implement it so that this happens. So that's where we are trying to come in to try to bring, I mean, we meaning the community, not just the people I work with, but as a community, the formal verification people who are interested in these kinds of things are trying to bring some order into this chaos so that what happens in practice can be validated and verified and, made more robust in theory. So I'll stop with that, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful talk. We will now move on to the question and answer session.
So I'm trying to.
Yes, so we have a question from Dr. Chitra Babu, ma'am.
Yeah.
So the question is, the correctness argument given by the Shapiro's group is not convincing because they're referring to the implementation itself for justification. So after you came up with this declarative spec, did you find that there was any compromise in the correctness of the earlier implementations?
Not really. I mean, we did not find any compromise in the correctness, but we did find, for instance, that there were some optimizations which we could do. So they were maintaining some kind of, unbounded timestamping. For instance, for the way that they had, the specific thing we were looking at was the set implementation. So they were maintaining these times. In their implementation, they had to maintain all these past updates forever. So they had these things which they called tombstones, which were timestamps of obsolete operations. And they had no limit on how long these obsolete operations had to be remembered. And we could show that by offering a more abstract way of analyzing how these timestamps were being used, that there is a point beyond which you can throw away old timestamps, and therefore you can optimize. Now, of course, I spoke to Shapiro about this, and he said, of course, we knew it all the time. But that's a different question, right? So, but the fact is that it could be correctness, or it could be that there are some unnecessary things which are going on, or things that you can do better. So in this case, there was certainly something that we found that that could have been done better, but not anything that was a drastic error.
All right, sir. Thank you, sir. So the next question: several NoSQL databases such as Amazon, DynamoDB, RAYAC, etc., have implemented CRDTs in their data store. Since it was not formally verified, was there any error in their implementations, or how can the practitioners benefit from this formal declarative spec? Will it improve the confidence in their implementation, sir?
See, I think a lot of this happens out of just from, if a lot of people use it and they don't find bugs in their, or they don't find unexpected behavior in their code, you can assume that the CRDT is doing what it's supposed to do. So this is, but the problem with concurrency is that bugs are very hard to reproduce or to analyze. So if somebody does find a bug, then why it happened is hard to do. So I cannot, again, going back to the similar answer to the previous thing, I think by the fact that people are still using these things, one can have some confidence that their implementations are robust. But the other point which is still there is that the requirements that you actually want from these systems often go beyond what a CRDT can promise you. So CRDTs work up to a certain point, because CRDTs really, for them to work, you need this kind of monotonicity, right? This monotonicity, by what I mean by that is this things go in only one direction, like counters only increase, maximum scores in a game only increase. So if you have this up and down thing, then many things don't work the way you expect them to do. So it becomes still a problem, a challenge to. So even though the underlying infrastructure is robust, it's kind of weak. So it's a bit like not having So, I mean, just a poor analogy, but it's like having to do your own mallocs, right? So if you have to maintain and manage your own data storage, of course you can do things cleverly, but if you make a mistake, then you are stuck with memory leaks and all that. Whereas if your system offers you garbage collection, there's a price, but then you have correctness. So in the same way, it would be nice if some of these systems could offer stronger data types beyond just the vanilla CRDTs that they offer. And that I don't see as yet, but I'm not an expert by any means, so maybe the technology is improving on that.
All right, sir. Sir, so the next question. While applying CIGA, what did the abstract model look like? Was it similar to a PetriNet, since you mentioned concurrent replicas and counters at each replica?
Yeah, so formally, you can think of it as a PetriNet. What we actually used was something called an asynchronous automaton, which is basically a product of, because the replicas are naturally, as we said, each of them can be thought of as a sequential object. So if you're familiar with PetriNets, then in a PetriNet, you don't have a notion of a component which is built in. So it's kind of left to you to imagine which parts of the PetriNet correspond to one component and which parts correspond to another component. So it's not always directly represented in the PetriNet. So an asynchronous automaton can be thought of as a PetriNet, but it is a PetriNet with more structure, where you say this is replica 1, that is replica 2, and so on. So that was the model that we used. But I would like to again clarify that this is all in theory, right? It's not that we had one working cigar system to verify somebody's code or something like that. So this is just a proof of concept more than anything else.
All right, sir. So the next question, what factors are considered in distributed applications to decide the optimal number of replicas, sir?
So that is a question I don't know. I guess it's a business thing, right? So I mean, ultimately your customers must be happy. That's what you want. Right? So when people complain about IRCTC, then it depends also on what kind of business you're running. If you're running a monopoly like IRCTC, you do not care much. But if you're running something where people will go to another service provider because your service is slow or inconsistent, then you will fix it. So I think it depends a lot more. I mean, there are two factors, right? One is a factor of usage, who all are using the thing and how many people are using it where. So I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to that. I think this is more an empirical thing, that if people are having a bad user experience, then you have to figure out why it is happening. Is it happening because you need to throw more hardware at it? Or is it happening because your underlying solution technology is not correct? But nowadays, the thing is that scalable hardware is becoming cheaper because of the fact that of all the investment in cloud, you can kind of deploy servers to scale up and down with the load. So, but yeah, it's more, I would say, a business and engineering decision than a kind of theoretical answer to that.
All right, sir. Sir, could you please comment on how such a formal approach could be of use in verifying the neural networks in terms of their robustness and explainability, sir?
Okay, so that is something which I'm currently interested in, but that's very hard to do because of the main bottleneck is this abstract. See, verification of anything requires you to compare what your system is doing versus what it should be doing. Now, the whole premise of a neural network or a machine learning system is that if you knew what it was supposed to be doing, you would not be using a neural network. You would have just written a conventional algorithm for it. So since you don't know how to write an algorithm that distinguishes cats from dogs, you try to train it with data. So this is one challenge, right? So the challenge is, what is the correct answer to which you should validate your neural network? How do you decide whether it's doing the right thing? But the more fundamental question, which is the tail end of what you said, is explainability. Okay, it is doing the correct thing on this sample data that I am testing it on, but is it doing the correct thing for the correct reason? Okay? So is it actually using some sensible aspects or features of my data in order to make the decision, or is it doing something totally spurious so that when I give it some other data, then it will get completely misguided and give me wrong answers? And that is the real harder problem, which is to understand what aspects of the data are being used to make the answer. And that is something which is directly tied to verification in a more traditional sense. So if you look at software driven systems, like, for example, the last 50 years, I would say that, since the 1970s or 80s, so at least the last 40 years, planes have been flying on software. Okay, so when the pilot presses a button, it's not that, it's not when he pulls something, it's not that something mechanically goes and pulls something. And today cars are being driven like that. When you press on the brake, it's not that something physically goes, it's more like an electrical signal goes somewhere and something happens, and there will be some electronic chip which will activate something. So for such systems, there is an elaborate way of validating that these things are performing correctly before things can be deployed. Now, we don't have that kind of assurance with machine learning based things, right? So if you have a kind of a so-called intelligent, for instance, intelligent insulin dispensing device, which is attached to somebody, which is supposed to regulate how much insulin it gives out, it's not very clear that this has been subjected to the same kind of tests. And then today with self-driving cars or even semi-self-driving cars like Tesla and all these things, you have these problems, right? So when something happens and the system goes wrong, it's very unclear why it went wrong. So unless we can explain what is the decisions made by a system, we cannot even hope to get this kind of reliability and robustness. So it's a very much an ongoing area of research, but I think even we don't even know how to address the question properly before we find the answer.
All right, sir. So the next question. So will the implementation of broadcast across the replicas will make the replicas consistent? Will the old changes which has missed casual order can even be ignored by comparing sequence numbers of the requests, right?
Yes, if you make the communication stronger like a broadcast, then you can make things more predictable, and therefore it's easier to guarantee correctness. But the problem, of course, is that implementing broadcasts in a small scale is one thing, right? But implementing broadcasts across the internet is not practical. So some assumptions like this have to be validated against the use or the scenario in which you're using them. But yes, surely if you can strengthen, that's why causal order, which I mentioned. Right? So causal order is strengthening of, say, just a queue-based FIFO, first in, first out delivery across individual channels. But this is in practice actually implemented. So you actually do have causal delivery mechanisms in messaging systems. So it's not so bad. But broadcast would be much harder to achieve. So you have to be careful about what you say.
All right, sir. So as a follow-up question to the abstract model question, would an asynchronous timed automata be a useful model?
Well, if you're worried about time, yes. But in the what we have looked at, what the questions we have asked, time does not really appear, in the sense that you are not promising any guarantee between the time you make an update on one replica and the time that it appears. But yes, if that is important, you can use time. But there are, theoretical problems with combining concurrency and time. See, because concurrency says something happens independently. But the question is time independent or not? So today, increasingly, all of us, for instance, check our time on our phones, right? And all our phones are usually set up to get the time from some kind of internet time server. So we really have, in a way, our clocks are synchronized, even though I would argue that at some level they're not synchronized. So therefore, I can always disambiguate that this happened before that, because the clock on my thing was before the clock on your thing. Now, so there is a difference between this causal independence and a temporal independence time. So marrying time and concurrency theoretically is very difficult, but more practically, we don't even know how to give these guarantees without timing guarantees. So if you add timing guarantees, it will be very hard to actually do anything.
All right, sir. So that was last question for us. So thank you very much, sir, for patiently answering all our questions. I really hope it was an enlightening experience for students. I would like to thank Mr. H.R. Mohan, Dr. Chitra Babu, Dr. Pushpalata, Dr. N. Sujaudeen, and Dr. K. Madeshwari for the smooth coordination of the event. Furthermore, I would also like to thank the other coordinators of ACM Chennai Professional Chapter, SSN ACM Student Chapter, and SSN ACM W Student Chapter for organizing this wonderful event. Thank you, participants, for being such a great audience. Dr. Madhavan Mukund, thank you again, sir, for an educative and informative evening. It was a pleasure having you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk at SSN. And as I said, I hope that we will all get a chance to meet in person sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Madhavan. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.